Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
All right. Hey, ready or not, here I come, I guess. And the answer is not, in case you were wondering how that was going to work out. Monday, March 21st, 2022. Time for another show. Time for another week. Time for, I don't know. Well, whatever it is you have time for, if you have time and we have time, doesn't that make it our time? I hope so. Plenty to catch up on over the weekend. Greg Dworkin already rounding up a raft of stories. War continues in Ukraine. I don't think anybody expected that to stop anytime soon. Still holding out over there, so I guess we'll check in with Greg. Greg will check in with Tim Mack. We'll find out whether Kiev is still, or Kiev, depending on whether we ever figure that out, is still in Ukrainian hands. By all accounts, yes. So, okay, we'll follow up on that. How long can they hold out? I don't know. Another interesting logistics thread making itself available over the weekend. The guy who did the widely shared thread about truck tires and how important the maintenance of those tires really was to military mobility is out with another update that likewise tends to indicate that the grace period for the Russian invasion may be coming to an end, and all of the logistical difficulties that the Russians have had in resupplying and supporting their troops via road convoy will continue. Very interesting. Always good to keep up on those things. Military people, generally speaking, seem to pay a lot of attention to logistics. I understand it's fairly important in moving massive amounts of personnel and material, and endlessly fascinating to me the dumb things that can go wrong, or the things that you assume will go right because they're mechanical, and if you have them, they will work. But that's, in the experience of most of us, military or otherwise, not the case. Every time I'm reminded every once in a while of how few mechanical objects in everyday homes work exactly as they're supposed to. Everybody knows the tricks to make them work well enough to keep them and not chuck them and get new ones that supposedly work better. But, you're used to what works for your stuff, and if you ever had to replace it, well, we all learned a lot about supply chain, too, during the pandemic, and how difficult it would be if you wanted to replace some of your mechanical parts in the house. They're not always available just because Best Buy online says they're available, or Amazon says they're available. They don't always show up exactly when they're supposed to. So learning an awful lot from this. That's not to excuse the presence of war in our world. Doesn't help anybody for the most part to keep these things going. But there are a lot of lessons learned from war, and I guess that's why it's most of history. Perhaps that's it. The only lesson we haven't learned yet is how not to have them. But I don't know. We're working on that one. All right. Let's see. Other things from around the country, around the world that are shareable this morning. I didn't spend a great deal of time on Twitter this morning. A lot of Russian going on. Not that kind of Russian, but a lot of Russian things going on. But a lot of rushing around in order to get everybody out the door, at any rate. Let's see. Plenty of news closer to home here in Virginia and across the country. Some disturbing Virginia news I can throw in here. I don't have much in the way of analysis to add to it except to make the announcement. One of the big items on Virginia Twitter yesterday anyway was that Glenn Youngkin continues to reveal himself behind the MAGA mask, or reveal the MAGA behind the mask, which is a mask of something else, I guess, a fleece vest. He's going for Halloween as a sexy fleece vest, and he's already got his costume. After replacing highly competent and professional Virginia elections commissioner, according to Blue Virginia here, Youngkin names a former legislative aide to a big lie promoter, and not just any big lie promoter. It is the big lie promoter known as Senator Amanda Chase. herself once a candidate for governor, dropping out before when she realized that Virginia was not interested in full-blown MAGA. They wanted MAGA with a pleasant suburban country club face, and found it in Glenn Youngkin, although it's questionable how many people really wanted it. The older people really wanted it, apparently. But at any rate, now we get the wages of having elected such a person. Not that that wasn't clear before, but Youngkin has appointed a Republican former member of the Chesterfield Electoral Board, who is also a former legislative assistant to Senator Amanda Chase. I think she's the one who described herself at some point, along with a number of other women across the country who continue to do this, as Trump in heels. I think that was her description of herself. Of course, no one bothered to tell her that Trump himself is already Trump in heels, but I don't think that would have stopped her. She also, I think, became briefly infamous in the state, I believe getting stopped at some point, maybe even at a checkpoint around the Capitol in Richmond, around the Capitol complex, stopped by police and doing a badge flashing, don't you know who I am sort of a thing. Anyway, the news, really, the upshot of this is that the plan is being executed exactly as everybody imagined it would be. Republican governors installing where they can election commissioners at the state level who are promoters of the big lie and who are interested in being in position when the call comes to them next time, as it did to Brad Raffensperger last time, to just find Trump or other Republicans to whom they might feel loyalty, find those extra votes that they need in order to make the initial claim that so-and-so has won the election, and make it much less suspicious when they then storm the Capitol and take people's hostage or whatever it is that they plan to do. So, I don't know. This continues to unfold right before our eyes, and right now, what do we do about it? We're just sitting around and saying, well, the guy is the governor, right? He does get to make these appointments. What can we do about it if he appoints somebody who says openly, I'll cheat so that Republicans can win elections? We have to sit here and wait until they do cheat, and then we have to find out whether we're still able to do anything about it with a Republican governor at the helm. So if you were waiting for that to happen, it has. So now we can move on to other news. At least you have closure on that one. All right, Greg is here. Good morning, Greg. How are you doing today?
Okay, and I'm glad you put it, so frankly, because that's the way it needs to be described.
Yeah.
Republicans are trying to install people who are willing to cheat.
Yes,
because
that's how you get
Republicans
the job.
cheat. I mean, it's just that simple.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no other way to deal with it.
They're not interested in who got the most votes. They're interested in which of their votes count the most.
Yes. If somebody else got the most votes or appears to have gotten more votes, that's an indication to them that there's cheating going on. That's when they have to swing into action. And sometimes when they get the most votes, they still say there's cheating. I don't know why they do that, but they do. But they just intend to find more. They want to
decertify Democratic votes. In their minds, Democratic votes are by definition not legitimate, because a lot of those people aren't white.
Yeah. And if they are, they're traitors to their race, which is something
speaking
they used to say back in the day.
Trump in heels, because there's obviously more than one. This one's Marsha Blackburn.
Yeah.
Discussing SCOTUS nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's coming up today. We'll talk about that before we get to the Ukraine stuff.
Important.
Says she wants to know Jackson's position on constitutionally unsound decisions like Griswold versus Connecticut.
Oh.
Which made birth control a protected right.
Yeah, that's so unsound that
because it confused Tennesseans.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. Does it?
And then she'll ask about Obergefell.
Okay. Good.
I mean, because the idea is, take away everything, because white Christian nationalists need to run this country, and who the hell are you to tell us we can't?
Right. When the courts get in the way, the decisions that they make are constitutionally unsound. Now, that's, Griswold, I think, is going to scare a lot of people, but the point is you'll find out when it's too late. Unless you listen to this show. Well,
it's also not the end of it.
Oh, well, all right.
Right, because then Obergefell and everything else, then, Handmaid's
Oh, yes,
Tale.
right. They're not going to stop at that. That's true. I mean, they're laying out their plans pretty clearly. Blackburn tells you what she wants to bulldoze over.
Yeah,
get rid of her.
You already know I'd like to cheat and make sure that we always win, but in addition to that, here are the other things we're going to do.
Yeah, so when we do win, when we steal it for ourselves, we're going to be bulldozing our way straight into your bedroom. So
political playbook today. Supreme Court confirmation hearings typically blot out everything else going on in Washington. This time, not so much.
Oh. Okay, I guess.
With war raging in Ukraine and Biden headed to Brussels for an emergency NATO summit, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's 4-day hearing marathon, which starts today at 11 a.m., may well be below the fold news. It's not just outside events dampening the suspense, with her confirmation all but assured and the balance of the court not in play. The likelihood of major surprises is pretty low.
I could go.
Then they go on to say, of course, this won't help Biden because he needs to have it high profile. So everything is bad for Biden. Everything is bad for Democrats. It's political. They don't really address the fact that one of the reasons we're not playing this up is because she's black, and who needs that?
Okay.
Right? We don't. It's historic, but I mean, so what? Historic for who? Not me.
Oh, all right. I guess that's true.
Why should we make a big deal out of it? Because we're the American news media, and we need to talk about important things like how Russia's winning.
Why would you want to? Well,
I don't know. We're going to get to that too, because that's really kind of a bizarre take that the New York Times has decided to go on. But we'll deal with that in a minute. Let's just finish this thread here. The senator who cheered on the January 6th mob seeking to block Biden from taking office has launched an attack on Biden's Supreme Court nominee.
Of course.
It just happens to track the fabricated lunatic beliefs of QAnon adherents, says John Harwood.
Weird that would happen.
And of all things, National Review takes it apart.
Yeah, well, I mean,
it's so bad even National Review can't go for
that role from time to time. Yeah, this is why I kind of like the idea of low-key for these hearings, because they're going to try very hard to, latch QAnon onto it once it becomes high profile. And I kind of prefer not to amplify that, but this is happening.
Right. So Josh Hawley, in case you missed it, accused Judge Jackson of being appallingly soft on child pornography offenders.
Sure.
The allegation appears meritless to the point of demagoguery, which, is what Republicans do, what Hawley does. And the idea that somebody of such low character that he would support an insurrection is challenging Jackson's credentials is pretty offensive.
It is. I am reminded also, by the way, others, pushing back on this. She has been Senate confirmed already to 2 or maybe 3 positions. I think maybe this is her third go-around with Senate confirmation. And somebody pointed out the idea that charges as outrageous as Hawley is making have gone unnoticed 2 or 3 times. Highly doubtful, to say to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Right. So he points out Hawley's a lawyer, a smart lawyer, and there's no way he should be unaware of not only his own history of not doing anything about child porn when he had the chance, but also that everything he says is greatly exaggerated.
Yeah.
Sex offenders who prey on children include deviants who rape children and those who force them into sexual acts. At the other end of the spectrum, sex offenders include people who've never put a hand on a child but are consumers of pornographic images which they possess, transmit, or trade, sometimes for money but often not. So well-adjusted people would be sickened. But when we talk about consumers, we're not talking about people engaged in the atrocious conduct that produce the images. It's rational to criminalize consumption, because they contribute indirectly, if usually unthinkingly, to production. If there's no market for the images, then they don't produce them. Yet the criminal law makes these kinds of distinctions all the time. The offender who commits a gruesome murder is orders of magnitude more culpable than the associate who helps him. But they're not nearly on a par. People understand why the murderer gets life imprisonment, but his low-level conspirator gets very light sentence. That's one part of it. And the other part of it is, her history of being a public defender. I mean, the idea that you're innocent until presumed guilty and everybody's entitled to the best possible legal representation of their case, whatever that case is just the way it goes.
Yes, and
that's part of U.S. law. It's part of the what makes the United States the United States. It's part of rule of law when that's capitalized.
Yes, one of those great things that Hawley says he's totally for, except for the part which helps him get elected, which he's against.
So he ends with
yeah,
saying the implication
thanks,
she has a soft spot for sex offenders who prey on children because she argued against a severe mandatory minimum prison sentence for the receipt and distribution of pornographic images is basically a smear.
Yes.
So, it's just
To
interesting
say
that
the
the most conservative person you could find who you could still stomach to read thinks that Hawley goes too far.
Yes, well, that's Hawley's thing, ignoring everything for his own benefit. So, all right, well, now we know the name of the person who has done this terrible thing. We could have guessed. I mean, if I had asked you ahead of time, who will come up with the worst smear of this judge? The answer, most people will probably say, well, let's see, Rand Paul, maybe.
Well, so part of the
Josh
question
Hawley,
I have, of course,
sure.
going forward, not is will she be confirmed? Of course she will. The question is sort of how many Republicans will vote for her, and more importantly to me, how's the media going to cover this?
Yeah. Well, my guess is a few, but not many, and the media will cover it as though they were doing the right thing somehow.
Will, mention that she was confirmed.
Yeah.
Because it's too affirming.
Yes. Well, look, 50-something is enough, and we'll just report that, and other people, they're doing it. Just might work, this crazy thing that they're trying to do.
Yeah, and we know who will do that. So, Rolling Stone has this piece last night from Hunter Walker, which was pretty fascinating.
No moss on it yet, as far as I can tell.
And while Rolling Stone isn't necessarily the most reliable publication ever, Hunter Walker is. He writes for a number of different places. Exclusive. Witness claims Trump's chief of staff, that would be Mark Meadows, was on the phone planning January 6th march on Capitol. Trump's team agreed it would encourage supporters to march, but try to make it look like they went down there on their own. Scott Johnson tells Rolling Stone. So he's naming names here.
Huh. All right. I mean, that's not terribly difficult to believe. I think we all thought that they would, although when they plan things, well, it didn't work, so maybe that is something they planned. All right.
So I'm out of my free articles, and Rolling Stone is one of the very few things apparently I don't subscribe to, so I can't read the whole thing.
Wow.
But having read it the first time when I still had a free article to read, they mentioned that Mark Meadows and what's her name, Katrina Pearson, are the two persons of interest that were mentioned specifically that the January 6th committee may be going after based on this fellow being questioned, Scott Johnson being questioned. And he gets the impression that those are the folks who are in the crosshairs. Well,
good. I get her bullet necklace when she goes in.
And again, Liz Cheney again said, it may well be that there will be criminal recommendations sent to Department of Justice. Interestingly, that doesn't automatically mean it'll be about Trump. Could be about Mark Meadows.
Sure. Yeah, and he's pretty high level. That would be bad news for him. Good news for me. Good news for John McCain.
Yeah, so. I suppose. Everything's good for John McCain.
Always.
So that's the background of everything else that's going on. And then, of course, we have the Ukraine situation. And I mentioned the New York Times in their coverage because it just struck me over the weekend, and I wrote a thread about how you read military Twitter and you get the feeling Russia's stalling. Their offensives have been stalled.
Yes,
they're digging in. They're not going anywhere. They're not capable of taking Kyiv.
Yeah,
and that leads to the next phase, which isn't great because lots of threats, lots of destruction, while Russia tries to position itself in the best possible manner for the best position to negotiate the end of the war. And that's the way military Twitter looks at it, and I'll give examples. Meanwhile, the New York Times yesterday had this big headline, Russia makes gains with attacks across Ukraine, which, to say the least, is a little bit misleading.
All right.
And then they corrected that later with a Russia appears to stall. Even NBC News and the nightly news and the quick summary, which relies heavily on video footage, was talking about the fact that the Russian advance was stalling, despite the destruction, which of course makes for videos on TV.
Well,
so Phillips O'Brien, who's an expert on this stuff, says a thread about how we report supposed victories in war, this one and others, why they don't matter nearly as much as people claim, and how they actually deceive us into understanding what really matters, partly motivated by that New York Times headline.
Okay.
The New York Times is reporting this morning that the Russians are making, quote, significant, end quote, gains in Ukraine. In specific, they're pushing into Mariupol, and they have hit 2 Ukrainian military facilities with long-range missile bombardment, pretty dramatic and breathless stuff. You can even throw in the hypersonic missile that may or may not have anything to do with anything.
Kind of exciting news or something over the weekend.
However, these are within the course of the war either unimportant or actually signs of Russian defeats. In particular, the attack on Mariupol. This is a humanitarian disaster and a war crime, first and foremost. Militarily, it's a sign of Russian defeat, even if they seize the city. And that's a dichotomy that we have to keep in mind at all time. If the New York Times says Russians are winning, and I say that's not really what's going on here, there are logistical issues making the Russian army not the second best in the world, but the second best in Ukraine, as the Twitter pundits note.
That's nice.
It's
Second
not
place,
to
though.
diminish the death and destruction that's going on. Or how can you say Ukraine's winning when look what happened to Mariupol? You got to keep these two things separate in your head, or at least at the same time. There's terrible death and destruction, and that doesn't mean Russia's winning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could argue that doesn't mean Ukraine's winning. Okay, but you can't, like the New York Times, present this as the inevitable, inexorable Russian army is crushing everything. That's not what's going on. Okay? Militarily, it's a sign of Russian defeat, even if they seize the city. The Russians have been besieging the city for weeks, have suffered significant attritional loss. Even if they take the city, they'll have to deploy significant forces to hold it. The whole campaign has been an indicator of Russian strategic failure. So you could argue what's happening is the New York Times is covering tactics when, in fact, the whole issue is strategy.
Aha. Could be true, sure.
It's worth taking a look at a more cogent analysis of what the campaign in Mariupol actually means by the Institute for the Study of War. Looks like they make that a topic of interest for them. The siege of Mariupol has weakened the Russian campaign, portraying them taking the city as a sign of success is bonkers. The ultimate fall of Mariupol is increasingly unlikely to free up enough Russian combat power to change the outcome of the initial campaign dramatically, they say. Now, the missile strikes, which have supposedly had, quote, devastating impact. There was the barrage earlier this week that hit Ukrainian logistical facilities in the west, which is weapons storage, and the very recent attack on the Marine base.
No.
Okay. And do these matter? Sure. Are they signs of dramatic events that are turning the war? No. Indeed, the drama comes from pictures as much as anything else. The attacks on the west might cause problems, but so far, Ukrainian resupply seems to be occurring pretty regularly, and in the scheme of things, Ukraine is being sent so many new weapons and advanced weapon systems that the destruction of one depot should make little difference. And it's worth noting, none of the reports can actually name specifics of what's damaged. Without an idea of real loss, these claims are dramatic hot air. And again, I'm old enough to go back to Vietnam era. You can bomb an airport, and you can have all sorts of holes on the runway, but if the planes that take off and land can, basically maneuver around them, you haven't taken the airport out of commission.
Sure.
That's number one. Number two, there was this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yes.
And the U.S. would, every night, 5 o'clock volleys, explain what the body count was, and at the same time, how we're, stopping resupply from this, then, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail just happened. Mm-hmm. And kept working, and it was local, and it was small, and it worked, and we never cut off supplies, and the bigger, greater army lost. I mean, so keep all of that in mind. That looks to have leveled a good deal of the facility and killed a large number of Ukrainian Marines, between dozens to 80. The whole facility only had 200. So losing 80 Marines is terrible, but the Russians are losing approximately 1,300 soldiers and a regular supply of trucks every day. Why, therefore, should this one attack be considered significant? And the answer is it shouldn't unless it was part of an overall increase in Ukrainian losses. No evidence for that.
Okay, fair enough.
The big meta stories in the war over the last few days are not to be affected by the stories that the New York Times and others see as signs of great success. What's not being reported is the steady attritional Russian losses in transport soldiers and fighting vehicles, and that tells the real story, and we'll do a lot of that after the break.
Okay.
Analysts retweeting the worst war porn from the Mykolaiv assault as if somehow to make a point about Russian success might think about what they're doing. Michael Kaufman has linked to some of the most terrible pictures with the claim that it's a disaster for Ukraine, and I have more on some of what he says. We'll link to those pictures because they're grotesque, but here's a screenshot of the tweet. I'd like an explanation of how this is such a great disaster for the Ukrainian military in an overall sense. So the sensational stories can be compelling and horribly eye-catching, but they distort more than convince. And it looks like the New York Times might have realized the need to change the narrative because they then followed, this is again something I pointed out on Twitter yesterday, after that Russia makes gains, then they had a headline, big banner headline, advance of Russian forces in Ukraine appears to stall. That was up on their website for a couple hours, and then that got taken down and other stuff went up.
No.
By the way, this thread is not a specific dump on the New York Times. Much of the reporting's been really good. It's generally a critique of how the media reports on war with a focus on the visual and dramatic. Like wherever Richard Engel is, that's what you're going to see on TV.
Okay.
So using it as an excuse to hammer one paper misses the point. Later today, we'll try to explain the vision of war that's developed in my research to better explain what I think matters. And this is something he does for a living.
Oh, well then, it's worth waiting for. I guess that is interesting, and I mean, maybe they're just setting us up so that for the relief when we finally find out that Russia doesn't win. Oh, well, we thought they were going to, and now I feel so much better about the world. I don't know. It's
Right.
a psychological trick.
Yeah, interestingly enough,
know
who's doing a fantastic job in covering what's really going on in Russia as far as the military goes is Marcos
Oh.
over at Daily Kos. His daily updates are really quite good and give a pretty balanced picture. Today's, for example, is good news, Russia can't win, bad news, neither can Ukraine, and which is probably a more accurate summary than what you read in the headlines in the New York Times, assuming you never clicked and read the stories, which are better than the headlines.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's entirely possible. But yeah, they don't know what to do with that. Here's a perfect opportunity to both sides something, and yet they won't do it. I don't know why. All right. Well, we'll return to this focus after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We got lots to catch up on. Everybody having a good time? Or we're back in. I was just wondering about. I checked during the break because we're talking about. I don't know. Are we back around to that yet?
Trent Telenko,
yes,
who's going to do a logistics piece here.
I don't know if we were ready for that one yet or not, but I didn't mean to jump the gun, but I got excited. And Trent Telenko, yeah, okay, he's the guy that did the thread a couple of. Maybe like a week ago? Seems like a year ago. Yep. On the importance of maintaining truck tires. And,
that's the one. That's
how
the guy.
bad things can go for you if you forget to not rotate the tires. We wasn't talking about that, but actually move the fleet once in a while and make sure that everything is on the up and up. Reinflate your tires. Keep the tire walls supple. You remember all that sort of brass tack stuff. So he's back.
Yes, he's got some more brass tack stuff, which is really fascinating.
All right,
so
Telenko.
He says, all right, ladies and gents, boys and girls, it's time for another truck logistics thread for this latest Russian invasion of Ukraine. In it, we're going to discuss the concept of operational attrition as applied to the Russian army truck fleet in combat in my now widely read thread on poorly maintained, cheap Chinese-made truck tires.
Oh, I didn't realize they were Chinese-made.
I explained how Russia lost trucks and mobility by not maintaining tires. This loss of vehicles without a shot being fired is referred to as operational attrition.
Okay.
This
Breaking
is
down.
just by operating vehicles. You lose some of them because they break.
Yeah, that's the military term. Operational attrition is when we break down.
Right. This gets a lot worse in combat. Each mile traveled by a military truck in war is between 10 and 20 miles where? That's pretty simple. So truck drivers abuse trucks because they don't want to die.
Right.
I was associated with 3 U.S. Army reset programs in 2003 through 2008 to fix the trucks that lived through a year of this. And my good friend at CLE, Gilbert Duran, wrote an article about the first phase of the effort, the Army Tank Automotive and Armaments Command Reset Program refurbishes trucks returning from Afghanistan and Iraq. Yeah, it's a long title, but authors in Army branch publications got to do what they got to do to get published. He says, as the low seniority DCMA guy, I got to do induction inspections on IED blast damaged trucks, and he shows examples. None of the vehicles ran, but mainly because they'd been picked over for parts. There weren't that many miles on them, but there were oil leaks, sludge, leaky radiators, carbon buildups, and the suspensions were beat to hell. Cab glass was noticeable by its absence. And this was in an Army that is professional NCOs that lived, breathed, and ate preventative maintenance as a religious catechism. And the U.S. Army enforced rest periods for its truck drivers because it cared enough about having men and equipment for future operations. And none of that is true for the Russian Army. Most of the time between 2012 and 2022, the Russian Army didn't maintain their trucks at all. They don't have a professional NCO corps. They're not doing it now. The overriding priority of Russian logistics is transporting artillery ammunition. And that part about not having professional NCOs is key, because it also means that in the field they can't make independent decisions to do things because that's what, operational situational awareness calls for. That's why they have their generals up front, and that's why the generals keep getting knocked off, because they're right up there on the front lines, because they have to make all the decisions because it's a top-down army. But aside from that, the overriding priority of Russian logistics is transporting artillery ammunition. By the way, they've lost 6 now.
Generals, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
6 generals and the vice chair of the Black Sea Fleet.
Oh, right. Yes, I saw that.
Who was in Mariupol, because I didn't realize Mariupol apparently is an island in the Black Sea, because, what was he doing there?
Yeah, right. You figure there's water around there somewhere.
Well, I figure they're running out of commanders, so you got to pull from where you can get.
That could be, right. You go do the Army thing. Bye. Well,
Well, that's all we got, We're out of generals. We got to use the marshals now.
I keep thinking of Andre. You've lost
what happens
another
with
general.
Stratego. You only have a limited number of pieces on the board here. Yeah. Every truck is being sent out in whatever condition, overloaded with ammunition. The engines are running white hot. Nobody's checked the oil or other fluid levels, let alone does an oil change. The Russian officer, meet the plan now, over everything else has real-world consequences with tired drivers. And it's not just convoy chain reaction accidents. Drivers fall asleep. They fall off bridges. He's got pictures of that. Running overloaded by artillery ammunition trucks who previously destroyed convoys are going to shred even good tires and catch road debris. Wow. And driving through and around this stuff takes a lot more time. And then there's the conscript factor. Who do you think was towing the helicopters in that video of Russians tow damaged helicopters off the field? Russian conscripts, that's who. And what does that mean in a panicked evacuation? Well, you pull your choppers as fast as you can to get about 15 kilometers or so away from where the action is. Mm-hmm. And after that, you slow the hell down and take your time dragging them to the drop-off point so they have as much safe time as possible before they have to do the next artillery run, which is to say, pull the copters out under the threat of being shot.
Right.
So fast, then slowly get it over.
The sooner we get back to base, the sooner they make us go back.
Right. So it isn't just a question of, okay, that's the tactics, and why do you do that to stay alive? The cumulative effects of all those factors leads to horrendous levels of Russian Army truck fleet operational attrition.
Okay.
6 to 8 weeks more fighting is going to deadline the entire Russian Army military truck fleet.
We'll see. Mark the date, I guess.
That means the Ukrainians can be attacking everywhere.
That leads to the strategy portion.
There's nowhere more than 20 miles inside Ukraine where Russian troops won't be out of food and low on ammunition. And that's what's coming.
You just got to last that long.
Right. And that's why logistics matter.
Right.
So the amateurs say, oh, look at the thing that blew up. Look at those tanks. Oh, cool. They're in a convoy. I bet they could do a lot of damage. And the professionals look at that and say, oh, what an exposed supply line.
What are you doing?
A disaster in the making.
Right. Sure. They remember the, scenes in Iraq.
And Afghanistan.
Yeah. Ugh.
for the Russians.
Yeah.
The Russians had convoys that just, let's go in the valley between these two mountains. What could go wrong? We'll go in single file, and, what could happen? Oh,
yeah.
Our lead tank just got blown up, and our back tank just got blown. Okay, we can't go forward, we can't go backward, and there's a mountain on either side. What do we do now? And there was quite a lot of that in Afghanistan.
Hit the reset button. Start the game over.
So this fellow Michael Kaufman that our first thread mentioned has another thread here today. Thoughts on the current state of the war and where things might be heading. About 2 weeks ago, I suggested Russian forces have about 3 weeks before combat effectiveness becomes increasingly exhausted. I think that's generally been right. Not quite there yet. The war is broken down into what can imperfectly be called 3 fronts, and Russian advances have stalled out along 2 of them. Around Kyiv, Russian forces are trying to consolidate positions. I don't think they can make an assault on the city. Kyiv is far from encircled, and that's what most of the analysts are saying. They don't have enough troops to do, hand-to-hand combat in street battles in Kyiv, because you need way more troops than they actually have available to them. In the southwest, there was a fitful advance around Mykolaiv toward Odessa that had little chance of success given the paucity of forces. This has been set back by a Ukrainian counteroffensive. I expect little progress there for either side. And that means we're not going to see an amphibious landing at Odessa or a Russian march to Transnistria anytime soon, at least not in this phase of the war. But Russian advances toward in the Donbas area threatens Ukrainian lines of communications west of the river, and the area to watch in the coming week is Russian attempt to encircle Ukrainian forces in the southeast. So inception of the Russian military efforts lacked focus, too few forces, too many axes of advance, some competing with each other. Instead of freeing up and consolidating forces to do one thing, they try to do 9 things simultaneously to do it fast. It didn't work. I think in the next 2 weeks, that was me, this is him, I think in the next 2 weeks they're likely to concentrate on Ukrainian forces in the east in the battle for Mariupol. I suspect unrealistic political aims and timetables, this is the interesting part, have driven an unsound military strategy. So that's where if you pay attention to tactics and you don't pay attention to strategy, you get screwed. Kyiv, Odessa, Donbas, there's a desperation to show progress. Increasingly, it looks as though the Russian military is focusing on the Donbas and maintaining themselves along other fronts. Depreciating combat effectiveness sets the stage for either a significant operational pause along most fronts or a ceasefire. This doesn't necessarily imply political settlement, but a period to reorganize, consolidate, resupply, and end to the first chapter of this war. I think Moscow is searching for something it can use to declare victory. Taking the Donbas and having leverage to attain concessions is probably what they're looking to accomplish at this point, at best a guess. So that is to say, if there are peace talks going on, and there are, and Moscow says, well, you have to denazify, give us your government and everything else, and Ukraine says no, and then Moscow says, well, would you believe, give us the Donbas and Odessa, and Zelensky resigns, and Ukraine says no, and then Moscow says, well, would you believe, give us the Donbas, and Putin resigns. I mean, every single time they come back to the table, they're in a weaker position. And Dave Rothkopf wrote a whole piece about this, basically saying U.S., Ukraine, NATO have a secret weapon against Russia, and that's patience. Very hard to do with the death and destruction that's going on. As we said in the beginning, nobody's discounting that. But from a strategic point of view, the longer this goes on, the weaker Moscow's position is. So at the negotiating table, they have to give up more and more to get out of this mess that they've created for themselves. So Michael Kaufman, back to him, says much depends on what Putin knows and thinks about the course of the war and whether he feels pressured at home. Our impression of the war in reality on the ground might be quite different from his. It's not clear he understands what the prospects for Russian success are, or lack of saying. Naturally, there's uncertainty about the state of Russian armed forces along different parts of the battlefield. It's bound to be uneven. We know even less about the state of Ukrainian forces. Again, that's why the New York Times banner headlines, which ought to tell you a story, really have to be written carefully, because otherwise you get the wrong impression that simply Russia's winning, and there's nothing simple about any of this. The next chapter in the war could prove even uglier, and that's the fear, of course. as it will turn likely into a war of attrition, greater bombardment of civilian areas, and here I'm more concerned about the future evolution of the conflict despite the remarkably poor Russian performance. Generally, I don't see how any military success can add up something that constitutes political victory for Moscow. If there's another phase, Russian forces will probably try to compensate for poor performance by inflicting greater destruction. Yes. And worth noting, the Russian military is interpreting demilitarization quite literally as a secondary goal in this conflict, going after Ukraine's defense industry. It seems they want to substantially degrade Ukraine's military potential. So has the war entered a stalemate? Well, yes and no. Russian forces may make slow, incremental advances in the Donbass. I suspect Ukrainian military can hold most fronts, maybe even counterattack, but attrition's undoubtedly taking its toll on both sides. So in general, I've tried to be cautious in rendering predictions because I think we don't know whether this is the beginning, the middle, or the end. Few things are as contingent and indeterminate. And so I think that's a pretty accurate summary of what's going on, and that's why I object to simplistic headlines in the New York Times and other places. Because most people don't read the articles. They just look at the headlines.
Hey, who has time? In today's busy world.
Yeah. Who has time? It's not like we're at war or anything.
Right. Well, we're not. So we have plenty of time. I guess that's true. It's the Ukrainians who can't bother to read the articles, and we should take the time to do that. But there's so much entertainment on television, and after all, you got to take all that in.
Right. So Jack Detch notes, top advisor to Zelensky now saying 6 Russian generals have been killed in Ukraine. And as somebody points out, Russians are losing so many generals, they're going to have to call up Mike Flynn.
Hey, you can have him. No trade, just, on spec. He's yours.
Yeah, pretty much.
Anyway,
that's my report for today. Okay. A lot of things to keep an eye on, a lot of moving parts here.
Yes.
But it's a really complex story in terms of the war. And, the people on the ground like Tim Mack who are reporting from Kyiv, who every day say Kyiv hasn't fallen, it's a month.
Oh, yeah.
Kyiv was supposed to fall in a couple of days.
Well.
Didn't. Not gonna. The question is what happens now and how much destruction happens between now and the end of the war. We don't know. It's bad. And so, winning, losing is, well, they're difficult terms when you're talking about death and destruction and all the stuff that's going to happen in between. And, of course, the worry that Putin, being desperate, will use chemical weapons, will use nuclear weapons. We don't know. We have no idea what's going to happen. We don't know what's going on in Russia in regard to the second front, which is the structural destruction of the Russian economy, what effect that has on the oligarchs, whether or not they want to oust Putin to get away from having their yachts seized. I noted in passing that one of the seized yachts was by a oligarch who specializes in nickel.
Oh, yeah, right. I did. I saw that one.
But, there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts and a lot of stuff we don't know about.
Yes. Nickel, we know about. That one we're up to date on. Okay. So, yeah, and one of those super yachts looked like like some sort of weird, converted icebreaker or something. He's doing a lot of northern sailing, I guess, this guy.
Right.
I don't know. Not a very attractive-looking thing.
Well, it's also built to tow Russian tanks that break down in the ocean.
Well, that's good. He's got the contract on that. So,
yeah.
These oligarchs, businessmen at heart, they're always looking to make a buck, even if it's cleaning up the destruction of this war.
Right. Our friend Darwin Darko writes in, I can tell you firsthand as a former Navy aviation logistics specialist, we maintained the airplane tire program, and it was a BFD. Well, I bet it was.
I'm sure. They land on those things.
The United States military literally has people dedicated to this.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently the Russian army doesn't.
Or they rotate through them very quickly. Yeah, I mean, everybody's a mechanic, I think, except they only get, 6 months of training and then push them out through, if they're lucky. Otherwise, it's like, here's a wrench, good luck.
Well, I think the bigger problem is Russian general. Are you maintaining these tires? And Russian conscripts. Yes, sir.
I guess so.
Okay, good, fine. Let's move.
All right.
Not good enough.
I have to come and take a look at it myself. All right. And that's how they get themselves killed. Unless it's happening where now I'm here. I can see you're not maintaining these tires. When I go back to Moscow and tell them, oh, no, a big explosion killed the general. Right. Some of that could be happening.
And again, I don't present myself as a military expert any more than I present myself as a lawyer. on this show, and we talk about the law. But, I read interesting people, and we're just talking here.
Well, right. I have been wondering about a lot of these things, and I have no basis for really speculating on any of them. But if we didn't, how irresponsible would that be?
So,
read the
I don't know what I'm talking about, but my superpower is finding people and talking to them when, in fact, they do know what they are talking about.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. Or at least people that make points that sound like they're salient ones as far as I go. I'm not certain whether I'm really getting a good education or not, but it sounds awesome.
If you want to know what's going on in Ukraine, read more than the New York Times. That's all I'm saying.
Definitely want to do that. Mm-hmm. And this is where, at least you come away with this lesson. Sometimes you'll get better information from a guy who you might say, what does he know? He's a truck mechanic, right? He doesn't know anything about this. I'm listening to the New York Times guy from Yale. That's the guy.
But I am a truck mechanic, and I spent some time in the Army before becoming a truck mechanic, and let me explain.
Yeah, right. And it doesn't really matter, like, how what does the polling say about trucks? It doesn't turn out to matter as much as what do the tires say about your trucks? Oh, well, that's interesting, and I'm glad we have gotten that perspective. And there's been a lot of appreciation of what's his name, Trent Telenko's threads by everybody. But I've seen in particular lots of people who have had the same experience in the Army and saying, finally, love for the Army truckers. I guess what you used to call motor pool guys. Yeah. But like a lowly, not very highly respected job in the Army because, brass is put on people's uniforms for show, for flash. It makes sense. The eye is attracted to it, but what makes the Army run is
shoot things and make things blow up.
Yeah. But, none of it works unless you're able to get your material to the right battlefield. So, fantastic.
Consistently and over time, not just on that first day.
So these are the truckers that matter, not the ones that are circling the Beltway. I mean,
are they still there?
Yes, they are, believe it or not.
I thought they were just cut off by bicyclists, and that's
that did happen over the weekend, too. Also, the guy who was ostensibly leading the protest out in Hagerstown has announced that he's going on vacation. He's taking a vacation from not driving his truck to any purpose, and everybody, he just left. I think he said he's coming back, but there's people like camped out in Hagerstown. Like the guy who was running it where'd he go? But yeah, over the weekend, right? Somebody pedaled their bike really slow, and they were stuck behind them and honking their horns, and it was really fascinating to watch these people, the truckers, get angry about being blocked in by traffic. This is really annoying. Yeah. That's what the locals think. But I also saw over the weekend that I don't know what exactly the offense was here, but they decided that a guy who was driving a Tesla on the Beltway was a huge jerk and needed to be placed under citizen's arrest. So they stopped their trucks and boxed him in a construction zone where there was no shoulder. And I don't know exactly what happened, but the video was circulating over the weekend of we found a Tesla driver. Arrest him. I'm not certain why. I didn't see any police arrive. I didn't see the end of the thing. But they were all very pleased with themselves, the truckers with their GoPro cameras.
So I'll just make a pitch for the Washington Post over the New York Times for coverage here. This is Washington Post last evening. Russia's war for Ukraine could be headed toward stalemate. Casualties, equipment losses, and a lack of progress on the ground are taking an unsustainable toll, experts say. And I mention that because you don't want to be in the position of saying, wait a minute, the New York Times says the Russians are winning, but all your experts say they're not. And who are we supposed to believe? Well, you're supposed to believe the Washington Post.
Yes, they have a reputation.
It turns out that all the experts who were talking about this, including former and current maintenance people, are right.
Yeah.
And the New York Times should go interview them in a diner somewhere in West Virginia.
Yeah, that's true. They probably are there. I mean, they even know where the diners are. It's a great idea. And really, actually, now that you mention it, it's just sort of, it's been the case of like life online for a long time. Like one of the things that was instantly fascinating about the blogs and the rise of the blogosphere way back when, during the Iraq War, early days, was that, the credentialed experts didn't seem to really be describing events on the ground correctly or accurately or in any way that was even comprehensible by the rest of us. And it turned out that lots of regular people who had gone on to become, orthopedic surgeons, dentists, mechanics, and plumbers said, you know what? I actually have some expertise about this. Let me tell you what I know. Oh, wow, I learned such a great thing. And the guy from the New York Times said not to listen to you because you're a plumber now. That is weird. And that has continued through the through line all the way to Twitter at this point and other social media. You discover that there are people who have specialized knowledge everywhere. And some of them are charlatans and tell you to drink your fish tank to cure your illness. So watch out for that, of course. Whatever. So it can go either way, but we do our best to view it critically and filter out as much of the garbage as we can and
right. In that regard, I have this 2010 piece from Daily Kos, which I think is pretty funny and sort of fits that. And it was written by a fella named Fish Grease.
Yeah, all right.
And he said, "Hi, I'm Fish Grease. I'm known mostly for my comments on any number of diaries about the Gulf of Mexico oil leak, volcanoes, and underground undersea leaks and such. Before that, I was known here for writing bland, confusing, useless, sometimes insulting diaries. But this is my expertise. And so now everybody understands that when we're talking about leaks at sea, this is what I do.
Hey, all right, right.
Follow me after the bump, and I'll conduct Daily Kos' first ever oil spill booming school."
Shoo.
I've been in oil and gas production for over 30 years. And he talks about his expertise and what you do about actual leaks. And instead of just talking to the guy who graduated from Yale, who has a job talking about every different thing every, twice a week. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about somebody who actually does this for a living, on the ground, who knows what they're talking about. Just one of those examples where the blogs were ahead of the media there.
That's cool. That's a good one. That's an excellent illustration of what's going on. For some reason, that link doesn't work for me, but maybe if you could, production note, grab the headline. I can search for that later on. You can drop that in the queue, and I'll go find it later on. But because a great example, I want everybody to be able to find it. There you go. Okay, so now you never know when you're going to run into somebody who actually knows a little bit about what the hell's going on with, what was it again? No, I can't. Now I'm blanking on the name of the oil leak out there in the Gulf. It had its own name. What was it? No, that's the tanker that ran aground in Alaska.
In California. This was
years ago. Valdez. But this one was the dang. It was a British Petroleum
was
thing
BP.
Out in the
Just call it the BP leak.
Yeah, but it had its own name. And someone has probably already tweeted it to me. I'll figure it out. But okay, I won't figure it out. I'll read it when somebody tells me. That's what I mean by I'll figure it out. Okay, but I thought, great point there. That's exactly the sort of thing that they would bring in people and so-called experts who they were like oil commodities traders and say, well, I know what it's going to do to the prices. And I know this much about how they pump oil out of these offshore drilling platforms.
Well, think of it as the BP Gulf of Mexico oil spill.
I will. Well, I'll have to until somebody says
individual platform may have had a name.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we were going with too, and that tells you how much this the flotsam and jetsam of instantaneous news coverage sticks with you. Oh, but then when the name pops up, we'll all say, "Oh yeah, oh right, now I remember." But you didn't until somebody reminded you. Okay.
Another example, and again from Daily Kos, this would be Brain Wrap. Charles Gaba, and discussions about what does Medicaid expansion look like with the Affordable Care Act. And started blogging about it, and then now is a national expert. But you got to remember, he started by blogging.
Yep, and just saying, Marcy Wheeler, very much the same way. I'm studying this stuff, and here's what I've learned. Me and Senate procedure, as a matter of fact, that kind of happened that way too. Deepwater Horizon, that's it.
Deepwater, yeah, there you go.
Okay, and it sounds like a movie.
Remember the days back in the day when you and Marcy and I used to blog at The Last Hurrah.
Yep. That's exactly what we were doing. And everybody said, you can't listen to them. They're talking about some other thing that they don't know about. And no, we did.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I was
Craig
talking
Bear
about medicine,
says,
and you were talking about the procedure, and Marcy was talking about the law, and
Right.
Scooter Libby,
yeah, and you were talking
which she
about,
later went on to write a book about and become a national expert.
And you were talking about how we were going to one
We were
day have
talking
a
about
flu
pandemic.
or flu-like pandemic, and we should prepare
Exactly
for it.
right.
Oh, dude, that's stupid. We shouldn't do that. I don't want any masks. I hate health. Whatever.
Yeah, why should you prepare for a
Yeah.
pandemic?
I don't know.
I mean, what could go wrong?
Yeah, we'll just pair later. Post-pair.
Yeah, well, post-pair. Why should you prepare?
No reason for it. Okay. Well, all right. Thanks. That brings us up to the hour, of course. And so music almost ready to, or about a minute away here, so we could still
So
chat.
they don't do blogs these days. What they do are Substacks and individual
Instagram.
columns, which,
Yeah.
by the way, are basically blogs.
Yes, they are. They're blogs sometimes that you have to pay for or something like that, which is kind of what we were thinking of last time we did the whole blog thing, but couldn't make it work. And, of course, we were just interested in talking to people who wanted to talk to us. And if you put up a paywall, you couldn't do that. But, yeah, that's true. Substackers, it's like they invented something new. But it's like when Uber reinvents, we'll put everybody in the same vehicle, and we'll all drive from one point to another, and then you can walk the rest of the way. That's a bus. Right, but Uber is doing it. Ah, okay. Cool. Right, so you learn a lot from these people. All right. Well, let's see. I want to acknowledge here. Seth Chipman and Craig Bear have all come up with the name, all tweeting right on schedule.
Thank
Deepwater
you.
Horizon. So thanks for bailing us out, guys. I appreciate it. I knew that it would happen that way. It's just the sound has to get to them. The stream is a little bit delayed, and those 15 seconds while you're waiting for someone to answer are kind of awkward. But you know how it is. It's like wearing an earpiece to a national presidential debate and having the bulge be visible in the back of your coat and everybody obsessing about it for 3 weeks. Do you remember that? Oh, well. If you do, see a doctor. Thanks, Greg. Not Greg, though. He's leaving. We'll talk to you on Wednesday. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Thanks to everybody who came up with the name of that Deepwater. I want to say that like they do in Scrooge, right? The SS Minnow, James. The Deepwater Horizon is the correct answer. How could we ever forget? And it does. It sounds like an exciting action movie type name, and I don't know, maybe that's how it went in one ear and out the other. But a great opportunity once again to have a check-in from the audience. I don't think either Seth or Craig, have we heard from you during the course of the show before or not? It's exciting to find out that there are people who have never been or are infrequently, at least, motivated to jump into the conversation and add something. But you need esoteric knowledge of a bit of trivia that everyone else has forgotten. These are your guys, and I know what that feeling is like. Right? I'm the only one that remembers, whatever that thing is. And it's usually me remembering those things, too. So it's a scary moment, and means I'm getting old and have to move into a retirement village, I think. But, okay, I'm going to just annoy everybody in the village as well. So, all right. Well, thanks for your help, everyone. Let's see. Other things to discuss today. There were many. I forgot all about all of them while we're talking to Greg, but let's see. What do I need to do to find these things? Oh, yes, Pocket. Right, that's the vehicle I use for piping these things in. Let's see. All right. Yes, this is the Rolling Stone article that Greg mentioned, which I haven't opened yet, so that means I have at least one more click left. But I'll just read that off the air at some point because we got the gist of that one. In other sort of weekend type tabloidish sort of happenings, not reported by tabloids, but, well, maybe originally reported by tabloids, but here by the staid folk at the New York Times, including, by the way, Michael Schmidt, whom we all know, and it's Michael Schmidt and Adam Goldman. Mike Schmidt, a Lafayette College graduate, I believe, and we're headed up there this weekend to visit and bring our youngest to poke around and see what kind of fun things he might discover there. I think we went there a couple of years ago with our oldest who was looking at colleges, and it's been a while. It occurs to me it might be one of our last visits there until, I don't know what, our 50th reunion. I guess we'll go back in 2040, something like that. At any rate, Lafayette College on the brain as a result. But Michael Schmidt, who probably wasn't thinking about old Lafayette when he reported this story, Ashley Biden's diary. Dramatic music, maybe? Sure. Why not? They tried, I think the beginning of the weekend, they were, the lunatics were running around still saying, Hunter Biden's laptop. Dun, dun, dun. Right. And it wasn't exciting enough for them, so by Sunday, Ashley Biden's diary. Dun, dun, dun. Poor put upon family. Ashley Biden's diary was somehow in the news. They briefly made an issue out of this. What was this? I don't know. 6 months ago, we found out about this. Maybe more. Time has lost all meaning. Do you even remember this story? I'm sure we mentioned it on the air. Everyone knows the Hunter Biden laptop thing. And by the way, they're trying mightily to bring that back. And I purposefully kind of avoided reading a whole lot about it. And it seems like somebody somewhere has come up with something that says, well, when we were reporting on this thing way back when, people said, oh, maybe it's just a garbage story. So we held back because we were afraid that we would get sucked in on a garbage story. But now it turns out that one aspect of the story that we thought was garbage might not be the particular type of garbage we thought it was. It might be other kinds of garbage. But doesn't that just prove that we were misled? And maybe there's some aspect of this where it can be redeemed, or somebody who, bet too much on the story wants to recoup some of their losses. But it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of room for, no appetite for taking it back up again. And all the problems with the story still remain. I think I may even have pocketed somebody else's thread about things like this. About, well, maybe I didn't. Maybe I was trying to avoid. No, there it is. Somebody else just saying, I went down this rabbit hole when it was a big deal, and I thought I might be missing something, that maybe there really is something to this, but there's just no there, was his basic conclusion. Anyway, then they turned later to Ashley Biden's diary, which we may have discussed on the air at some point, that James O'Keefe from Project Veritas was involved somehow, and that the basic background story was that Ashley Biden's diary had been left behind somewhere in a room she was staying in. She had, she shared a place with somebody and left and moved elsewhere and left behind accidentally maybe a duffel bag full of stuff or whatever. And then the other person moved out, and the new tenant moves in, and oh my gosh, it's a map of, it's a treasure map. It's whatever. It's Ashley Biden's diary, and I happen to, be closely enough allied with James O'Keefe that I could give it to him, and they could publish it, and totally will change the election, because everyone knows that a presidential candidate's daughter's diary is going to be what's on everybody's mind at the kitchen tables and the diners, etc. Anyway, that too is back. And I don't know why, but let's find out. Ashley Biden's diary was shown at a Trump fundraiser. That's kind of gross. Weeks later, Project Veritas called her. Right, that's what it was. I think I saw Rachel Bidikofer tweeting about the upshot of this story, which was not only did they go through all these contortions, sharing this diary around among news outlets, or right-wing news outlets, everybody trying to decide who would have the... what shall we say, the gall to either publish the contents or publish about the contents and break this news. And no one was quite willing to do it. But in the meantime, they apparently passed the diary around to rich donors at a Trump fundraiser and said, look what we got. We're going to get her. We're going to get him with this. This is going to make or break the election. Anybody want to read the diary? The diary. So, as Rachel had said in tweeting around, imagine, you're running for office and your political opponents steal your daughter's diary and pass it around to their donors at a fundraiser. This is who we're talking about. This is a major political party in this country. So anyway, what's the contents of the article? The subheader here says the right-wing groups, that's Veritas, deceptive call to the president's daughter a month before Election Day is among the new details that show how the organization worked to expose personal information about the Biden family. Please blow up Project Veritas in Donbass. If you can get them over there, that would be very helpful. A month before the 2020 election, Joe Biden's daughter, Ashley, received a call from a man offering help. Always hang up on men offering help. Striking a friendly tone, the man said that he had found a diary that he believed belonged to Ms. Biden and he wanted to return it to her. Ms. Biden had, in fact, kept a diary the previous year as she recovered from addiction and had stored it in some other belongings at a friend's home in Florida where she had been living until a few months earlier. The diary's highly personal contents, because it's a diary, if publicly disclosed, could prove an embarrassment or a distraction to her father at a critical moment in the campaign. And, of course, the contents don't include anything like, oh, my father, I'm so upset because he's doing all this corrupt stuff in Ukraine. And that's what they wished it had said. You know, but it might, at worst, it's probably like, well, you know, why should we elect you? You're such a terrible person that your daughter has addiction problems, and here they, you know, I mean, I guess that was the idea. I don't think there's any like political revelations in it. At any rate, she agreed with the caller to send someone to retrieve the diary the next day, but Ms. Biden was not dealing with a good Samaritan. The man on the other end of the phone worked for Project Veritas, a conservative group that had become a favorite of President Dr. J. Trump, according to interviews with people familiar with the sequence of events. From a conference room at the group's headquarters in Westchester County, New York, surrounded by other top members of the group, the caller was seeking to trick Ms. Biden into confirming the authenticity of the diary, which Project Veritas was about to purchase from two intermediaries for $40,000. Where do they get $40,000? All sorts of articles detailing their dark money origins and which weirdo billionaires are responsible for making sure that they have $40,000 to spend on stuff like this. So yeah, I guess they were trying to say, you remember that diary that you left at this place? And if she were to say, yes, I absolutely did write a diary and then leave it at that place, then they would know that it was true and they could print it. But I don't know. Maybe she was savvy enough to say, I mean, I guess so. You want to return a thing that you think is mine? I'll send a guy and then we'll pick it up. And I don't know. If it's not mine, I'll give it back if you want, or I'll throw it out. I don't know how well she did with that. The caller did not identify himself as being affiliated with Project Veritas because they're such good journalists. According to accounts from two people with knowledge of the conversation, by the end of the call, several of the group's operatives who had either listened in, heard recordings of the call, or been told of it, believed that Ms. Biden had said more than enough to confirm that it was hers. Oh well. The new details of Project Veritas's effort to establish that the diary was Ms. Biden's are elements of a still emerging story about how Trump supporters and a group known for its undercover sting operations worked to expose personal information about the Biden family at a crucial stage of the 2020 campaign. As I recall, the initial go-round of stories was all about Project Veritas and James O'Keefe sort of distancing themselves from this thing. Oh, we heard about it, but we didn't want to publish it. We weren't sure it was true. We weren't sure it was real, and even if it was, we weren't sure if we wanted to print it, so I guess that story is falling apart too. Drawn from interviews, court filings, and other documents, the new information adds further texture to what is known about an episode that has led to a criminal investigation of Project Veritas by federal prosecutors, who have suggested that they have evidence that the group was complicit in stealing Ms. Biden's property and transporting stolen goods across state lines. And by showing that Project Veritas employed deception rather than traditional journalistic techniques in the way it approached Ms. Biden, the caller later identified himself with a fake name. The new accounts could further complicate the organization's assertions in court filings that it should be treated as a publisher and granted First Amendment protections. Oh, that will make problems for them. Project Veritas regularly carries out undercover stings, surveillance operations, or what they like to think of as undercover stings and surveillance operations, and ambush interviews, mostly against liberal groups and journalists. Have they ever done anything else? I'm not sure. At the same time, new information about the case suggests that the effort to make the diary public reached deeper into Trump's circle than previously known. A month before the call to Ms. Biden, the diary had been passed around at a Trump fundraiser in Florida at the home of a donor who helped steer the diary to Project Veritas and was later nominated by Trump to the National Cancer Advisory Board because he himself, I guess, was a cancer on society, and he thought, maybe this is where I want to be. Among those attending the event, Donald Trump Jr., though it's not clear if he examined it. He took a chance at that, of course. But I guess that's one place you could get $40,000 to buy the diary later on, right? If it's of such interest to this donor, a big donor hosting a fundraiser in Florida, maybe the fundraiser was to give Project Veritas enough money to buy the diary. Who knows? Federal prosecutors have been investigating how Project Veritas obtained the diary and last fall carried out searches at the homes of 3 of the group's operatives, including that of its founder, James O'Keefe. In court filings, prosecutors have suggested that the organization was complicit in the theft of some of Ms. Biden's other belongings, which interviews show the group obtained as it was seeking to confirm the diary's authenticity. Project Veritas, which is at the moment suing the New York Times for defamation in an unrelated case, has denied any wrongdoing or knowledge that the belongings had been stolen. It has portrayed itself as a media organization and is being unfairly investigated for simply doing journalism and has assailed the Justice Department and the FBI for their handling of the case. Prosecutors have signaled that they view the circumstances very differently, all but dismissing in one court filing the group's defense that it was acting as a news organization, saying that there is no First Amendment protection for the theft and interstate transport of stolen property. Usually not. In response to a request to Project Veritas for comment, O'Keefe sent an email criticizing the Times, his favorite pastime. Imagine writing so thoroughly divergent from reality and so mendacious with innuendo that there is literally no utterance that won't make it worse, he said. What a journalist, huh? I can't even make sense of his email prose. Spokesman for the FBI and for federal prosecutors overseeing the case in the Southern District of New York, declined to comment, as did Roberta Kaplan, a lawyer for Ms. Biden. The Times has previously reported that the story of Project Veritas' involvement with the diary began in the months leading up to Election Day. In July of 2020, a single mother of 2 moved into the rented home of a former boyfriend in Delray Beach, Florida. The woman, Amy Harris, a Trump supporter, told the former boyfriend that she had little money, had nowhere to live, and was in a bitter custody dispute. Shortly after moving into the rental, Ms. Harris learned that Ms. Biden, also a friend of the former boyfriend, had been staying at the home earlier that year during the pandemic. Very convoluted and unlikely, but things happen. Ms. Biden had moved back to the Philadelphia area in June of 2020, around the time her father clinched the Democratic Party's nomination for president. She stored a couple of bags of her belongings at the rental house along with her diary, and she told her friend who was leasing the home that she planned to return to retrieve her things in the fall. But then her father was running for president and things got crazy. In August, Ms. Harris reached out to Robert Kurlander, a friend who had been sentenced to 40 months in prison, because that's who you hang out with, in the 1990s on a federal fraud charge, and had expressed anti-Biden sentiments online to say she had found the diary. The two believed they could sell it, allowing Ms. Harris to help pay for the lawyers representing her in the custody dispute. You see what things drive people to desperation. New details from interviews and documents have further fleshed out what happened next. Mr. Kurlander contacted Elizabeth Fago, F-A-G-O, Fago, the Trump donor, who would host the fundraiser, attended by Donald Trump Jr. When first told of the diary, Ms. Fago said she thought it would help Trump's chances of winning the election, according to 2 people familiar with the matter. Richard G. Lubin, a lawyer for Ms. Fago, declined to comment. On September 3rd, Ms. Fago's daughter alerted Project Veritas about the diary through its tip line. Everybody wants a hand in this thing. 3 days later, Ms. Harris and Mr. Kurlander, the guy who had been in jail, with the diary in hand, attended the fundraiser attended by Donald Trump Jr. at Ms. Fago's house in Jupiter, Florida, to see whether the president's reelection campaign might be interested in it. While there, Mr. Kurlander showed others the diary. It's unclear who saw it. After the criminal investigation into Project Veritas became public last fall, a prominent Republican lawyer who was lobbying on behalf of the organization and Mr. O'Keefe briefed a group of congressional Republicans on the case to urge them to try to persuade the Justice Department to back off the investigation because the group did nothing wrong, according to a person briefed on the matter. And remember how sensitive Republicans are to leveraging political influence against prosecutors, right? Joe Biden, Hunter Biden's laptop, Burisma, he went to Ukraine to try to persuade the Ukrainian prosecutors to back off of his son. Oh, wait a minute. We found out that somebody might have stolen something from Biden's daughter. Let's pressure the Justice Department to back off the investigation because it's fair when we do that and unfair when others allegedly do something different in a totally different country. And then turns out that they didn't actually do it, but whatever. Okay. So where were we here? Right. They tried to get the Justice Department to back off the investigation because the group, they say, did nothing wrong, according to a person briefed on the matter. The lawyer, Mark Paoletta, which lawyer? The Republican lawyer was lobbying on behalf of Project Veritas and Mr. O'Keefe. That's Mark Paoletta, said that upon learning about the diary at the fundraiser, Donald Trump Jr. showed no interest in it, and said that whoever was in possession of it should report it to the FBI. Although, if that was the case, if he really did that, I guess we'll say congratulations to Donald Trump Jr. just 4 years after supposedly learning the lesson that when something fishy happens, like Russia comes to you and says, we want to talk about adoptions, wink, wink, really sanctions, and we have dirt on Hillary Clinton for you, and you say, if it's what I think it is, I love it, and everybody says, you don't just take that, you're supposed to report that to the FBI. Somebody brings you dirt on your father's opponent, you got to call the FBI. So now he knows, at least, I have to tell the newspapers that I said, no, I don't want to see that, call the FBI. Whether or not that's what he actually did, hey, I would say that remains to be seen. Good avenue for investigation. Anyway, shortly thereafter, Paoletta, who had served as Vice President Mike Pence's top lawyer in the White House, called back the congressional Republicans to say he was unsure whether the account about Donald Trump Jr.'s reaction was accurate. Is he saying that he thought it might not be accurate, that he said, I don't want to see it, call the FBI? I don't know. I'm not certain what that's supposed to mean. But anyway, Mike Pence's top lawyer in the White House, and something, and then they wanted to hang him. I don't know what happened there. Lobbying filings show that Mr. Paoletta was paid $50,000 during the last 2 months of the last year to inform members of Congress about the FBI raid on Mr. O'Keefe. I would have done it for $35,000. Make phone calls and say something. Raid on O'Keefe. Mr. Paoletta and a lawyer for Donald Trump Jr. did not respond to messages seeking comment because no one was paying them to make those phone calls. Once Project Veritas learned about the diary in early September, I think we had the timing right about when we heard about it, right? The group sought to acquire it. About a week after the fundraiser, Ms. Harris and Mr. Kurlander flew to New York with the diary. Didn't FedEx it, they flew with it. The pair met with several Project Veritas operatives at a hotel on Manhattan's West Side. The two sides began negotiating an agreement. That's why they didn't FedEx it. But no final deal was struck at that stage, and Ms. Harris and Mr. Kurlander returned to Florida, still in need of money. And then they wasted money on a plane ticket. In response to questions about what Project Veritas may have asked him to do to help authenticate the diary, Kurlander, through his lawyer, Jonathan Kaplan, declined to comment. And you know you're in trouble when your lawyers are getting lawyers. But Project Veritas had to confront tricky questions. Was the diary really Ashley Biden's and not a fake or a setup? Ooh. How could Project Veritas, best known for its undercover sting operations, be sure it was not a victim of its own deceptive tactics? And the answer is, of course, with more deceptive tactics. Your lawyers get lawyers, and you spy on the people that you think are spying on you. To authenticate the diary, one of Mr. O'Keefe's top lieutenants, Spencer Meads, was dispatched to Florida to do more investigative work. What happened next is a matter of dispute, and one of the major issues in the investigation. Project Veritas has said in court filings that its operatives obtained additional items belonging to Ms. Biden that their, quote, sources had described as, quote, abandoned, suggesting that it had no knowledge of any theft and that it had gotten access to Ms. Biden's belongings in the same way that journalists receive information. The sources arranged to meet the Project Veritas journalist in Florida soon thereafter to give the journalist additional abandoned items, lawyers for the group wrote in a federal court filing. Project Veritas's lawyers had long instructed its operatives that encouraging or incentivizing sources to steal documents or items could ensnare the group in a crime. That is to say, they were pretty afraid that Project Veritas had committed or was going to commit crimes, and they kept counseling them how not to do that, or at least how not to be convicted of doing it. Okay. In a memo to Mr. O'Keefe in 2017, one of the group's lawyers concluded, quote, under controlling precedent, PV, Project Veritas, enjoys substantial legal protections to report and disclose material that may have been illegally obtained, provided it played no part in obtaining it. But at least one of the sources told others that a Project Veritas operative had asked them whether they could retrieve more items from the home that could help show the diary belonged to Ms. Biden, according to a person with knowledge of the exchange. Additional items were then taken out of the home and given to the operative, one of the sources had told others. In response to assertions from Project Veritas that it had done nothing wrong and that its role in the case was protected by the First Amendment, prosecutors accused the group in court filings of making unsworn statements that are either false or misleading and are directly contradicted by the evidence. They also stated that even a legitimate news organization would have no First Amendment defense for acquiring material through theft or another crime. Put simply, even members of the news media may not with impunity break and enter an office or dwelling to gather news, prosecutors said. I'm sure they would say, well, we didn't break in. The guy who lived there let us in. Maybe. Without citing specific evidence, prosecutors directly challenged one argument from Project Veritas in particular, the group's repeated claim that they had no involvement in how the victim's property was, quote, acquired. The plan for Ms. Biden to have a friend retrieve the diary from the person who called her in early October fell through, and the accounts that Project Veritas has laid out in court papers and to the local police in Florida about how it obtained the diary and dealt with it in the final weeks leave open questions about how the events played out. Or we could even say leave open questions about how they played out. Project Veritas told a federal judge on October 12th that O'Keefe sent an email telling his team that he had made the decision not to publish a story about the diary, adding, we have no doubt the document is real, but that reactions to its publications would be characterized as a cheap shot, and they can't have that, right? The date provided by Mr. O'Keefe for the email was shortly after the call to Ms. Biden. But 4 days after Mr. O'Keefe told his staff that it would not publish the diary, a top lawyer for Project Veritas told Biden's campaign that it had the diary and wanted to interview Biden on camera about it. The Times reported in December. That's the part I remember. Less than a week after that, Project Veritas finalized a deal with Mr. Kurlander and Ms. Harris to buy the rights to publish the diary for $40,000, wired them the money, and signaled that the group planned to soon publish it, according to a person with knowledge of the case. In the end, Project Veritas chose not to publish, $40,000 down the drain. Instead, an obscure right-wing website published the diary in late October, but it got little attention before the election. O'Keefe was furious, and with some within Project Veritas thought that one of its own operatives, frustrated with the group's unwillingness to publish the diary, had leaked it. Ooh, intrigue. Project Veritas decided to have one of its operatives take the diary and Ms. Biden's other belongings back to Florida. According to a Delray Beach Police Department report, a lawyer showed up at the department and gave the items to an officer. The lawyer, according to police body camera footage, said the items were, quote, possibly stolen. Finally fessing up to things, telling the truth at last. The police alerted the FBI, like they're supposed to, which had an agent retrieve Ms. Biden's diary and other belongings. Almost a year later, the FBI approached Ms. Harris and Mr. Kurlander. About time. About 2 weeks later, FBI agents obtained search warrants to raid the homes of Mr. O'Keefe and his two of his operatives, Mr. Meads and Eric Cochran, both of whom left the organization after the diary project and their homes being searched. In the case of Mr. Meads, his lawyer said the FBI broke down his apartment door. Well, too bad. Court documents indicate that the FBI seized 47 devices, including a dozen phones from Mr. Meads. That's the actual end of the article. We actually made it there. A dozen phones never looks good. Ask Rudy about that one.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Much else to gather up. I think I'll skip the Hunter Biden laptop revival thing for now. Maybe we'll check in on that perhaps if anything else happens later on in the week, but I think it looks like it might be dying its own natural death at the moment. Let's see, other items that we detected over the weekend that were of some interest include the announcement by the press shop at the Supreme Court over the weekend that Justice Clarence Thomas had been admitted to Sibley Memorial Hospital in Washington, D.C. on Friday evening after experiencing, and I'll let you fill in the blank, after experiencing blank-like symptoms. Okay. Well, he was experiencing flu-like symptoms, which, in the current atmosphere is cause for worry. However, the announcement went on to say he underwent tests, which I assume means COVID tests. He was diagnosed with an infection, but, presumably, according to this wording anyway, and what has happened subsequently, not an infection of COVID, maybe, but it's weird to just say an infection. But then it goes on to say, and is being treated with intravenous antibiotics. So to the extent that that's, true, and that they're not lying about that, or not intentionally giving him the wrong treatment for various reasons, presumably then not a viral infection, but flu-like symptoms, but I guess that could be just about anything these days. Flu's not a bacterial infection, it's a viral infection. But okay, so he had an infection of some kind, whether that was what was giving him the flu-like symptoms or was incidental to his flu-like symptoms, I don't know. But it says his symptoms are abating, he's resting comfortably, and expects to be released from the hospital in a day or two. Justice Thomas will participate in the consideration and discussion of any cases for which he's not present on the basis of the briefs, manuscripts, and audio of oral arguments. So he's not going to listen in remotely and try and participate. He doesn't participate in oral arguments, generally speaking, anyway, so no big deal. A little weird, but apparently, they said this was released on the 20th. That was yesterday, but he was admitted on Friday evening, And as they say, he was expected to be released in a day or two, but by the time we even got the announcement, it had already been a day or two. And the announcement wasn't that he was out, it was that he was in. So anyway, all eyes, elsewhere probably, really. But okay, one eye wandering over to Clarence Thomas, who I think somebody passed. Here it is, right up at the top here. Brian Monroe passing on the news. He says the situation has made a turn for the worse. He's expected to make a full recovery. Okay. Well, all right. I can't say I didn't think the same thing. But at any rate, sounds like, even if he was in the hospital with COVID, for the VIPs, they pump you full of all kinds of treatments and send you back out. Speaking of the pandemic, though, I'm becoming increasingly concerned, and we didn't talk about it today, but we probably could next time around with Greg. There's, more indication or more people who sound like they're in a position to know, saying, just wait, I think we're going to have a BA2 wave here that's going to send everything, into a tailspin in terms of, everybody thinking it's over and having the recovery and everybody unmasking, and it's just the wrong time to be unmasking. And I'm concerned that might be true, but I don't have any hard and fast evidence to show to anybody to convince them to do otherwise, to the extent that I am, in some small part responsible for a masking policy that's being made in our little corner of the universe. And I want to say, couldn't we just hang on just a few more weeks, because according to some of these people, in about 2 to 3 weeks, we'll be back in a spike. And the problem is, as somebody was laying out, did I even put this aside? I don't know if I put this thread aside. I just sort of read it and said, oh yeah, that's something to think about, which was that we learned earlier in the pandemic that looking at deaths or even hospitalizations, while an interesting metric, but they were, of course, what did we learn? The terminology for this was a lagging indicator, right? You only find out about the number of deaths and even the number of hospitalizations weeks after it's too late to have done it, to do anything to prevent it from getting worse. You only find, the deaths come weeks later. Even the hospitalizations come weeks later. And that the decision, as good as it was a decision to provide everybody with home test kits, it was a little late for one thing, but one of the less desirable consequences of putting those test kits in everybody's hands was that, we didn't do any training, or I don't think we set anything up either, that made it clear that, okay, if you test and you test positive, here's what you should do. Not only treat yourself, but if it just could have had a toll-free number on the box or something. If you test positive, call this number, so that you would be reporting your cases, so that we would be getting an accurate count of how many positive tests there were. Back when everybody had to drive through or stand in line or whatever to get a test, a PCR test that was processed by a lab, you could be pretty sure that all the positives were being reported. But home tests, you find out you're positive, you say, damn, I won't go to the, whatever it was you were planning on going to, which is usually why you take a test, or whatever. You're not feeling well, you take a test. Then you just self-isolate, and you don't bother telling anybody official. You might tell your friends, I'm not going because I tested positive. But, the CDC never necessarily finds out. And as a result, one of the things that ended up happening is that we lose out on the leading indicator, the positive tests that tell us, A, what's really happening, and B, what to expect in our hospitals and elsewhere, and do we need to prepare for any, emergency surge capacity or anything. There's now thousands of people who are testing positive, some of whom may need hospitalization, aren't telling the hospital systems that they're in the pipeline. And so testing, one, becomes less reliable and less widespread, and it's even to the point now where people just say, if I have flu-like symptoms, I'll just assume it's COVID, but I'll assume it's Omicron, and I've been, at least partially vaccinated, or I'm fully vaccinated, so I'm hoping that means I won't need any hospitalization. I'll just stay home and wait it out. But as a result, the report doesn't get out there, and if you do later become hospitalized, or die from it, right, that will get reported, but not until later. Now, community prevalence is something of a lagging indicator. We only find out that that the infection is prevalent in an area when we get the other lagging indicators that say people are in the hospital or dying in larger numbers. They must have been infected 2 weeks ago. We just didn't know about it. And it means that community prevalence, which, by the way, one, it won't be reflective of what's currently going on anymore. And two, that's the basis upon which most people have set their policies about masking. Everyone has permission if they want to unmask. And of course, everybody then put in the obligatory language about please be respectful of everyone else's masking choices. Yeah, right. Well, whatever. Anyway, some people are and some people aren't, but we're all making it optional to unmask based on community prevalence, the positivity rate in the area, etc., all of which may have been skewed by the fact that people are testing at home and not reporting their results, and we don't know. So by the time we find out, hey, something's wrong, we're already in the hospitalization and death portion of the game, and it's too late to do very much about it. At that point, you mask up the best you can. If you're lucky enough not to have contracted it by that point, good for you. And hopefully the masks will get you through the rest of it. But in the meantime, you're going to catch a lot of people by surprise. And we'll have been making our masking policies based on indicators that are no longer valid. I'm a little bit afraid of that one. So keep an eye out is all I can tell you. It reminds me, let's see, there's another long-ish form piece here that I did read over the weekend, although I was upset by some of the construction of the language in here because it's Politico. Interesting article, though. The South's healthcare system is crumbling under COVID-19. Enter Tennessee. And Tennessee has been in I'm spending a lot of time on my screen lately, too. Tennessee, another of the states I found out over the weekend, suffering under a majority Republican legislature, and therefore now making its torturous way through stupid bills that, like the Idaho bill we heard about at the end of last week, among other things, allow a rapist's family to sue anyone he may have impregnated during the rapes, and to seek the $10,000 or $20,000 bounty from them if they got an abortion as a result of becoming impregnated by the rape. And the rapist's family can, at least technically, make out like bandits. I don't think anybody has done it yet. I don't think that law has been passed anywhere, but it shouldn't be for a number of reasons, not chief among them. But I found out that they're doing the same thing. Copycat law there about that. Anti-CRT, supposedly. Anti-CRT law there, too. Tennessee more or less being ravaged at the legislative level like everybody else. But what's up in Tennessee with healthcare? It says here the state is a poster child for how rural areas are suffering disproportionately amid the pandemic in the worst public health crisis in a century. But apparently one that the author of the piece, Daniel Payne at Politico, thinks we're not talking about. There's a kind of an annoying construction in here, I think up top. We'll probably hit it real soon. But there's another good point or two contained in the piece, which is why I put it aside. By the time COVID-19 hit Haywood County, it was too late to prepare. Sounds familiar. The rural county in the Tennessee Delta near the Mississippi River had its healthcare system ground down in the years leading up to the pandemic. Ever since the 84-year-old Haywood County Community Hospital closed its doors in 2014, the number of doctors and other healthcare professionals dwindled. Residents who were once on a first-name basis with their care professionals were left to book appointments at facilities miles from where they'd raised their families and grown older. It's a familiar story, the breakdown of the rural healthcare system, but apparently correlates a lot more closely even than Trump support versus Trump opposition in terms of how people did with the pandemic. Now, of course, that tends to overlap with rural settings too, but an important point that it correlates most strongly, and it makes sense, more sense than correlating with your voting preferences, your access to health care. I mean, of course, it will make a difference. And this article does a pretty good job at detailing how. Haywood County, with its flat land and fertile soil, generations of proud farmers, but a low per capita income of about $22,000, is something of a poster child for rural America. It's also a prime example of the decline of rural health care and how rural areas are suffering disproportionately in the worst public health crisis in a century. Some of the biggest disparities in the COVID-19 crisis aren't just among red states and blue states, or black, white, and Latino populations. They've been between rural and urban communities. True and sad and difficult to countenance, but you should also remember that Trump's initial reaction to the arrival of COVID-19 and the novel coronavirus here in the United States was, well, screw it. It's landing in the cities, and they're blue. Time for some healthcare problems in New York City and elsewhere. And they should let it rip, because it's just going to kill them instead of us. And someone probably could have tried to tell them. Maybe they even did. Yeah, well, this is going to be a global pandemic. The disease is going to reach everywhere, and the places that have little to no access to hospital facilities are going to be hit the hardest, And he says, what are you talking about? That's like more than 10 minutes away. So, what do I care? It's time for Wapner, right? So, he doesn't give a damn. And I'm sure they never were able to and probably he wasn't even, you like to think that even an idiot president is surrounded by people who might know what they're doing. And that was the theory about electing the idiot president in the first place. They'll keep him in line. There's no keeping him in line. Plus, it turns out that everyone around him was an idiot too. Of the 50 counties, to return to Politico here, of the 50 counties with the highest COVID deaths per capita, 24, this is some metric, 24, in other words, a minority of them, but okay, 24 are within 40 miles of a hospital that has closed, according to a Politico analysis in late January. Nearly all 50 counties were in rural areas. So of the 50 counties with the highest COVID deaths per capita, almost all of them are rural. And a significant portion of them, almost half of them, are, that's a weird metric, but there it is, within 40 miles of a hospital that has closed. Rural hospital closures have been accelerating, with 181 since 2005, and over half of those happening since 2015, according to data from the University of North Carolina. But that may be just the beginning. Over 450 rural hospitals are at risk of closure now, according to an analysis by the Chartis Group, one of the nation's largest independent healthcare advisory firms. Those closures caused shortages of beds, ventilators, and medical staff, and left behind patients with high and rising levels of such complicating factors as diabetes and hypertension. Now those communities often also have high rates of unvaccinated people. And that may well be related. Now, this is an interesting reasoning for it. It reads a little bit like an excuse, but it could happen to some people. In the communities where health resources disappear, so too does confidence in the medical system. Trusted sources of information go elsewhere. Yeah, that's true, and it's a roundabout way of saying, I guess, trusted sources of information disappear, so that people possibly you could convince me then turn to the internet and learn instead that drinking your fish tank will prevent COVID-19, or eating your horse's ivermectin or sheep dip or whatever will prevent, and you say, well, I do have access to that at the feed store, but I don't have access to a hospital because it closed. That's better way of saying it. The closure of Haywood Community Hospital in Brownsville left local resident Jack Pettigrew with a 35-minute trip to the nearest emergency room, thinking COVID-19 was going to kill him. Now, why does rural resident Jack Pettigrew think COVID-19 is going to kill him when so many other rural residents think COVID-19 doesn't exist? You'll find out. Honest to goodness, when we were backing out of the driveway that day, I had the strangest feeling that I wouldn't be coming home, he said, at home, so he made it, recalling how he worried about the long trek to the emergency room. Why, though, would he believe that it was a good idea to go to the emergency room when so many of his neighbors thought it was a hoax? Pettigrew, who retired in 2020 after practicing medicine in Brownsville for 37 years, there you go, had spent his career treating a population that watched Haywood County Community Hospital shrink over the years until it finally closed entirely in 2014, like 6 others in western Tennessee that closed in the same time frame. That's a lot. Stories of people dying because they couldn't get care fast enough started popping up everywhere after the closure. Underlying conditions became a bigger problem. We would constantly make appointments for people for mammograms or diagnostic tests or whatever, and I guess later COVID, right? And 2 weeks later, we'd get a note that the patient never showed, recalled Pettigrew. And you never know whether you missed a breast cancer or whatever because they just didn't go. Then the pandemic hit. In the case of COVID, we faced some of the same challenges, Pettigrew said. In our rural area, there are a lot of people that don't even have transportation, so they rely on somebody else to take them places and bring them back. If they don't have something like that, a lot of times they just kind of ignore their situation, and it gets worse and worse and worse until they've gone beyond the point of return. And I suspect there were a lot of people that got COVID that didn't do anything about it until they got extremely sick, and then, unfortunately, a lot of them didn't pull through it. Haywood County, this is interesting, tinted blue in most elections, has a middling vaccination rate by national standards, but it was still higher than surrounding counties. Nonetheless, the number of people who died of COVID in Haywood County is in the 97th percentile nationally, well above many nearby counties. Overall, rural communities have seen almost twice as many deaths per capita as metropolitan ones. But again, I do remind you that it was Donald Trump's perception that the deaths would largely be metropolitan and therefore he didn't care. Pettigrew survived his own bout with COVID-19 after a harrowing experience at the nearest hospital in Jackson, Tennessee, where doctors and nurses were frantically battling COVID surges that led steady streams of patients from communities across western Tennessee that had lost their own hospitals. Pettigrew's sense of dread deepened as he heard codes called over the intercom, knowing many of them meant people were dying all around him. He texted his son, asking him to call when he was alone. Pettigrew didn't want his wife to hear him tell his son about important documents and safe combinations in case he died soon. Not that he was keeping the combination from his wife. He was trying to keep her from panicking about his possible death, but what a scene. After a day in the ER, he was finally moved to another room where he would spend 5 days before returning home, much like Clarence Thomas. I'm just saying. His outcome was better than many, not only because he survived COVID, but because he could get to a hospital, because he survived the trip there, and because a bed was open at all. His wife, with COVID-19 and double pneumonia, would be turned away from the hospital. He wouldn't even try to bring his dad, who was in his 90s and would eventually die from the virus. We knew they basically weren't going to keep him or do much for him because they were basically hospitalizing people that were in an age group that would possibly survive and then be back into a normal life, Pettigrew said. In rural hospitals in western Tennessee, people would wait days in emergency room hallways, hoping for a bed to open up, even if the bed were on the other side of the state. Nurses would have to hand pump air into patients for hours with manual ventilators because of shortages. Other hospitals in West Tennessee would connect 2 patients to a single ventilator, while their owner, Braden Health, tried to buy ventilators from a recently closed field hospital, but they had already been sold to another state. One hospital in the region, Houston County Community Hospital, moved 50 patients into a nearby gymnasium. It's one of those ripple things. It's touched most everybody, Pettigrew said. Most everybody knows one of those stories, and it's really sad. And what's also really sad is how many people in that county probably still think COVID is a hoax. And to tie it back to another story, that we were just talking about. Thinking about all this stuff, people in the staying in the hallways of the ER for days, and nurses hand pumping, manually pumping ventilators, and multiple people hooked up to single ventilators, and all this stuff. All the while, to kick back to the previous story, James O'Keefe was telling everybody, using the hashtag on social media, film your hospital, right? Telling everybody there's nobody in the hospital. This whole thing is a hoax. I went by my local hospital and there was nobody. There weren't anybody dying in the parking lot, right? Because they're all dying inside. Or if you go in, let me go take a look at the COVID ward. No, you can't, because if you go in there, you'll get COVID and you'll be here sick. They don't let you in. I don't know what was going on and what was going through these people's minds. But let me just remind you that James O'Keefe, in case you forgot in the interim, is a terrible person and deserves all the problems he has and more. But, he's out here trying to decide how to handle Ashley Biden's diary, legally speaking. But months before, he was telling everybody this whole thing was a hoax and don't worry about it, and there's nobody sick. Meanwhile, hand pump ventilators in Tennessee. The piece that really kind of bummed me out about this is actually up next. It's a longer article, and we're not going to make all the way through, but we'll read this part here. After telling us how sad the situation is and how desperate they were for equipment, there's this section. Warnings go unheeded. Ready for this right off the bat in the first sentence. Washington ignored years of signals that the South's healthcare system was crumbling. When the pandemic began, it was too late to rebuild. And I had to pause there as I was reading this yesterday and say, and tweet about it too. I feel like Washington didn't ignore the years of signals. I feel like, quote unquote, Washington actually had quite a lot to say about rural hospitals and healthcare in rural areas and especially in the South. But I also feel like maybe Politico could have pinpointed this a little bit better. Like, it wouldn't be a real risk to say, well, Republicans kind of ignored years of those signals. And the signals were coming not necessarily just from, people randomly in the South, but from Democrats who said, we really ought to do something about this and make sure that people have access to health care everywhere, whether they live in the rural South, rural North, or anywhere. And it's really a problem. And we ought to fund federally qualified health care centers. And we ought to, have everybody sign up in a scheme whereby everyone would be covered by insurance so that all the hospitals that are losing money hand over fist for uncompensated care are taken care of. But I feel like it wasn't so much Washington ignoring the signals so much as it was, my recollection of it was that, quote unquote, Harry and Louise told everybody that this is the way it should be and that we ought to want it to be this way because something, profit, personal choice, yada, yada, for-profit healthcare, privatized best medical system in the world, something. And every attempt to try and even out the playing field for people who were losing access to healthcare was socialism. And we better stop it right now because that's what people at kitchen tables really wanted. And it also seems to me that the news reports later, and maybe it's not true. This county says it's tinted blue, but it seems to me like that worked pretty well across much of the South that then lost their healthcare system and then they all died. What can I tell you? Maybe some of it is poetic justice for agreeing with Donald Trump that maybe a whole bunch of northeastern city folk would die instead. And they did, but then it became your turn. Oh well. The rate of rural closures accelerated over the last decade, as you know, with 2020 setting a record, even as demand for their hospital services was growing to an all-time high. Imagine setting a hospital closure record in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last decade, 138 rural hospitals have either partially or completely closed, according to data from the University of North Carolina. Well over 3 times that many, 453, are at risk of closure even now, according to a 2020 analysis from the Chartist Center for Rural Health. Of that group, 216 are at a high risk of closure. Other analyses are even more pessimistic. Over 500 rural hospitals are at immediate risk of closure, according to a 2022 model from the Center for Healthcare Quality and Payment Reform. Everybody, it's like rolling trippingly off the tongue, all of the centers who are studying this. It makes me feel like Washington wasn't ignoring anything. In Tennessee, both models show over half of remaining rural hospitals are at risk of closure, just like in other states across the South and Midwest. Not to focus solely on Tennessee. It's happening everywhere. All right, well, Tennessee and the entire Southeast was nearing a crisis well before the pandemic, with hospitals operating above surge capacity even before the first infections were reported. But James O'Keefe said, nothing's happening, everybody go away, and if you do get sick, eat horse paste. I don't know what to tell you. Seems pretty weird and like maybe a bad plan to begin with. But yeah, I'm a little annoyed about the idea of quote-unquote Washington being blamed for having ignored all of this stuff. All right, many other things to get to that we didn't get a chance to get to today, but that's fine. Tuesday is coming. Tomorrow we'll talk to Joan McCarter about things and when the government's going to close again, whether we can arrange that to happen. Housekeeping. Friday, I can't be on the air live. We'll see if I can't record you a little something to pass the time at least, and we can get to all these stories that we didn't get to today, possibly do it that way. Or, of course, the other way to rely on our Netroots radio friends to bring you information we didn't get to today. There's the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam coming up next. He's got a lot to tell you, and we got a little time to tell you a little about what's coming, too. Let's see, the life of Putin's favorite fascist Russian philosopher, Ivan Ilyin, and his work reveals the mindset of Vladimir Putin on his invasion of Ukraine. We'd like to get a look at that.
From netrootsradio.com.
Let's see your chart.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Elsewhere, policymakers say it's time to rethink the census after results released by the Bureau showed Black, Hispanic, American Indian, and other minority residents were undercounted at a greater rate in 2020 than in the previous decade. Much more, of course, from around the world as well. Checking in on news globally next.